When you go to the doctor, you assume that he or she is not going to intentionally give you something that will make you sick or hurt you. Why is that? Well, doctors have ethical guidelines that they follow that prevent them from intentionally doing harm. Similarly, scientists have ethical standards that guide their research and interaction with others. These principles include being truthful, honest, and reasonably objective, and they come into play throughout the scientific process, from the design of studies to collecting and recording data, interpreting results, publishing and communicating those results, properly acknowledging others, and agreeing to review the work of others. So how do those ethical principles work in practice? I'm a geologist. My research takes me to the field where I collect rock samples and take photos and measurements and make observations. I send rock samples off to labs to be analyzed and find out how old they are and what they're made of. I put that together into an interpretation about the geologic history of the area. How do ethics fit into that? To begin with, maintaining ethical standards for me means keeping a detailed and rigorous notebook. I record each day where I go, where I am when I take my measurements, and what I do with the samples I collect. This is important because if I didn't, when I got back home to analyze and interpret my data, I would either be wasting my time on measurements that I cannot connect to a specific site, or worse, I may be tempted to just try to recall from memory where those measurements were taken, and risk being wrong. Second, I don't just pick the data that I like to report. Instead, I report them all, even if some didn't work, or even more important, if they didn't fit my original hypothesis. In one of the areas where I've worked, my colleagues and I had expected that the volcanic rocks on top of the mountain range would be relatively young, only about 4 million years old, while the rocks at the bottom of the mountain range would be quite a bit older, around 28 to 30 million years old. Instead, when we got our samples back, we learned that that whole thick sequence of rocks was all about 28 million years old. We didn't ignore the data that didn't fit our hypothesis. We actually went back and collected more samples to make sure this finding was correct. And this made us totally rethink how and when the mountains had formed, which was actually very exciting. You might have noticed that I said "we" a few times. The paper that eventually got published included 3 authors that did a lot of the fieldwork and 2 others who did a lot of the lab work. We all discussed ideas together in the analysis of the data, so another way that ethics fits in is that it was important to credit everyone who was involved in this research. For scientists who study people or animals, there are additional ethical obligations, and they are explicitly enforced. To conduct studies on mice, for example, scientists must have their study approved by their Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, we call it IACUC, before beginning their work. The research protocols for humans are described a bit in another video about collecting data from people, but here I'll mention that they must also be approved by the Human Subjects Research Council. Sometimes scientists do things they shouldn't and behave in ways that violate these ethical standards. Now, people make honest mistakes and mix up samples or record the incorrect location of a sample. That's not a violation, as long as people report their mistakes and correct their record. Far less often, people intentionally commit outright fraud. Most of these cases become famous, or even infamous in science, in part because they are so rare. One famous example is Piltdown Man, a fossil skull discovered by Charles Dawson in 1912 in Britain. Dawson claimed that the skull represented the missing link between ape and man and that it was 500,000 years old. A lot of people believed him for a very long time. It wasn't until 37 years later that new techniques allowed dating of the skull to determine that it was only about 500 years old, and in fact wasn't even a single skull, but contained parts from a human and parts from an orangutan. Dawson hadn't just made a mistake. He concocted an elaborate hoax, including chemically treating the skull to make it look older because of his desire for fame and fortune. These types of things still go on. Sometimes it may be just a few data points to make a line look straighter, or leaving out a few measurements to better support your ideas. Sometimes it involves faking a whole data set. When ethical breaches do happen and are discovered, it's important to correct the scientific record, since that is what we build on every day through all of our research. And science has mechanisms to do this. When published findings are revolutionary or unique, it's common for others to attempt to replicate the research. If no one can replicate the work or scientists have really inconsistent findings, they'll publish those results as well. If fraud or significant mistakes are discovered, published papers can be retracted or removed from that record. For individuals who commit fraud, the penalties could be high, taking away funding, firing, even taking away a degree. No one wants that to happen to them. For scientists just getting started, it's good to get in the habit of being detailed and thorough in keeping track of your work, and also maintaining open communication with your mentor and your colleagues. We all make mistakes. If you make one, don't worry and don't try to hide it. Talk to your mentor as soon as you recognize it and talk about how to fix it before it becomes a bigger problem. And whenever you have a question about what the right thing to do is, just ask.